Hello and welcome to Riverland Women, the podcast which celebrates the amazing achievements and inspiring stories of women across South Australia's Riverland. I'm your host, Kerry Lush from the podcast station. Join me each fortnight as we meet some of the extraordinary women who call this region home. This is Riverland Women. Typically, we feature stories from those who live or have lived in the Riverland. But in this episode, we're doing something a little bit different. This interview originally aired on another podcast I host, the Citrus segment. I hope you enjoy this crossover episode, which looks at the importance of the citrus industry in the formation of the region, including how the Riverland got its name.
One of the things that surprised me, just from someone who didn't actually grow up in the Riverland, I didn't know, and maybe more people know this, that the name Riverland didn't actually become the name of the region until the 60s. And it was just, she says, the name of the brand of the oranges that were marketed internationally to begin with.
That's Amanda Wells. She's a PhD candidate researching the environmental history of citrus growing in the Riverland between 1948 and 1970. Amanda explains what she's been exploring and why.
And looking at what I'm calling citrus worlds. So it's not just about who did what, when and where. It's about how it all affects everything and how the Riverland came to be, this very citrus-centric region.
What led you to going down this path and choosing that topic?
It was a little bit of a convoluted story. I wanted to do a PhD when I was little. And then we were in lockdown in 2020 and I thought now's a good time. And so I started looking into a few things, including another ancestor of mine who was George Wyndham, and he started vineyards in the Hunter Valley back in the early 1800s. And it reminded me of what my grandfather did in the Riverland at Cooltong in the 50s. And I wanted to know more about that. And it turns out no one had really written about that. So I thought that's a good opportunity. When you do a PhD, you're trying to find an original contribution to knowledge. So if you start with something no one's written about, that's a good start. Yeah, so it's been an interesting way into that. But my grandfather passed away in 2008 as well, so it's a nice sort of way to come back to learning about him and a part of his life that I never really knew about.
Where did you start? How did you start it all off? And how far into the process are you now?
Well, I started pretty much very broadly because I actually have my background is in anthropology, not history. So I sort of had a want to look at everything approach rather than a lot of historians will find a specific archive, they'll work with that archive, read it closely and work from there. But I wanted to know everything and then work my way into themes and things like that from there. But in lockdown in Melbourne, that was very difficult to do. So I started with Trove, which a lot of people who are separated from their archives and the place where they're researching, they go to Trove. And the Murray Pioneer obviously has records on there until 1950. So I was reading through that to see what was happening where and when and all of the interesting connections around the place and the Chafies and all of that early history. But I wanted to really zoom in on that post-war, post-Second World War period because that has had very little written about it. There's a lot for the post-World War I period because that didn't go super well for a lot of those soldier settlers across Australia. But yes, not so much about where my grandfather comes in.
Where does he come into it all?
He went to school at St Peter's and he loved agriculture. And I believe the Robertsons came down to their class to talk about what was happening up at Chowla. And I think he had a family connection with them as well because they lived in North Adelaide. But anyway, he left school when he was 16 or 17 in 42 and went up to work at the orangery at Chowla. And after the war, he was in the Navy. He came back to work there again and applied for a block as part of the soldier settlement scheme and was allotted one at Cooltong in 1950. So he moved in and, he got his tractors, he got his trees and everything.
Now, this is where the story gets a bit weird because until I sat down with you here today, I had no idea that there would be any connection between the property of my husband's ancestors and your grandfather. So that's South Australia for you, though, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So he worked for the Robertsons. You said he went to St Peter's, so probably they all knew each other through school as well. That's how he ended up there. So he got to learn about citrus growing and then ended up with his own block.
Yes, yeah. So he was always into agriculture and tractors and all those kinds of things, which, you know, my little nephew, who looks very much like my grandfather, is sort of doing that now. He's very tractor obsessed. So I can imagine my grandfather doing the same thing and finding this connection with someone who the family already knew and the opportunity to work up in Chowler on an orange setting. And he loved the tractors, the technology, growing, cultivating, all of that kind of thing. So when the soldier settlement scheme came up following the Second World War, he was very interested, and it had been sort of orchestrated by people at the Renmark RSL. The Edmonds family, for example, were very involved in that. So whereas in some parts people were sort of reticent to do it again because it hadn't gone so well the first time, it seemed like the irrigated soldier settlement areas were going to do better. And I think that was a wise choice, as well as conveniently being in his area of interest, his special interest of citrus growing.
So you started with your grandfather with your study, and then how has that expanded?
I did originally want to look specifically at Cooltong because, you know, you have to start somewhere, but there wasn't a lot of records that I could access about Cooltong from my little home office in Melbourne. So I expanded it out to the Riverland. So I've been looking at the Murray Pioneer and the Australian Citrus News, or Citrus News as it changed titles halfway through my research period, and just trying to understand the common themes about what was happening in terms of the expansion of citrus growing, the changing irrigation techniques, influences from overseas on how we do things in Australia. That's an interesting thing. And sort of the environmental effects of citrus. Obviously, irrigation's a big thing, water, but pests, and obviously at the moment on the top of everyone's mind is fruit fly, which is something that I hadn't really looked into too much until the more recent outbreak in 2023. I'd been more looking at red scale because that sort of popped from the pages in the 1950s. When you have a pest that has the word red in it, you immediately got, oh, are we going to find something interesting about people using political language to describe pests? But you know, it wasn't so bad as it had been in the United States, making very on-the-nose jokes. But yeah, I've looked at fruit fly and the implementation of those roadblocks in the 50s and 60s. It's interesting, trying to control that spread and the ways we talk about pests and native and non-native animals.
You really have already. You've talked about so many different elements of the industry. It must be tricky to try and rein that all in, or to keep a focus.
Yes, it is. And I think one of the good things about a PhD is you've got supervisors, and they help to remind you that, yes, Amanda, your approach is great. You want to look at everything. However, you need to be done in 3.5 years. This needs to be in 100,000 words, not a million words. So early on in the process, I worked it back down to, I came up with 6 sort of chapters. So I've sort of grouped it in with themes to do with migrations and the emergence of the name Riverland, which happened in the 60s for the region. Obviously, it was the brand of oranges from the 30s. And then looking at the way that commodities are produced and the impact, sort of like the capitalist history of it, intertwined with environments and human lives and animal lives and that kind of thing. So it sort of goes from very, very Riverland, very specific on the ground, to very theoretical, very
right,
very traditionally academic. So I like to have both those parts. I think it's important to have the part of the thesis where it describes in detail exactly what these places look like, because that's where it started for me, but it's also fun to experiment with these theoretical things that people wouldn't assume would come from research about citrus in the Riverland.
Okay. What are some of those things that you could expand on?
The theoretical stuff?
Yeah.
I've got an idea called Deathly Capital, where talking about the way that death is sort of commodified in agricultural spaces, especially coming into the 20th century, the deployment of poisons. And I came in my Australian Historical Association conference paper this year, I talked about an incident that happened in Cooltong in the 50s where a whole lot of molluscs became stuck in the pipes, and due to drought weather, extreme heat, they were all baked and became stuck, and they did an injection of chlorine so that all this amazing, disgusting material was flushed into the settlement of Cooltong, and their shells and stuff got caught up in the sumps and everything like that. So it's sort of this very, I called it molluscs in the machine, because you sort of imagine these unsuspecting creatures who are just looking for a nice dark damp place to hang out, get moved on, killed in the name of efficiency in these kinds of processes. So I'm just sort of trying to experiment with those ideas of how agriculture and horticulture work with ideas of life and death, and the spatial and temporal configurations of how these things work.
Wow. Wow, there you go. And as far as what the industry looked like in this period that you're looking at, how did it evolve over that time? You said from 1948 to the 70s, was it?
Yeah, that's right. 1948 I start, because that's when Cooltong was established, and I've just sort of stuck with that date because it's firmly post-war, and up to 1970 because you have to put a line under it somewhere, but that's when the Dunstan era begins, and it was pretty much Playford until 65. So there's sort of certain ideas about development and that kind of thing that are associated with Playford, and he was an orchardist as well, but obviously not with citrus.
How did the industry change, or what did the industry look like between 48 and 70?
So one of the key things that I found that's really interesting, that sort of justifies this research, is that between 47 and 70, the area planted under citrus more than doubled, 200% plus in South Australia. And most of that, I think I read from the Yearbook of South Australia, that it was like 80% of those trees were planted in the Riverland. So that is significant expansion, obviously influenced by those soldier settlements, but then the private places, Sunlands and those kind of places, were also implemented there. So I think the massive expansion made obviously a huge difference in how things were marketed, and they had to find new markets for the produce. They expanded on marketing strategies that had been developed in the 20s and 30s, and everything just sort of became a lot more industrial scale, that sort of mass production. You've also got the introduction of juice, stabilised juice, which is obviously a very important part of the industry now, but that only happened as a result of technology that was developed in the wars. So that's, those sort of interesting longer term effects of these big global developments that come into the Riverland.
Yeah, well, that's right. I guess so. They were trying to come up with products that would last out on the fields.
Yeah, and that has an influence as well in how we treat pests, because obviously red scale is a big issue, and it changes the way that the citrus looks. It's not an appealing product when it's covered in scale, or the tree is covered in scale even. It looks different. But that's not so much of a big deal if you can use those lower quality citrus in juice production. So that's a big change. Yeah, and I think 1965 there was also the citrus industry inquiry that the South Australian government held to look at developments and whether things should be controlled, marketing, cooperatives. Obviously, a lot of citrus was done, marketed and sold through cooperatives. And as we approach the 70s and 80s, cooperatives become a little bit more of a bad word when it comes to economists and the neoliberalism and those sorts of things. So, yeah, it's a couple of decades of big change, mostly driven by that massive expansion, I think, in South Australia.
I'd imagine varieties grown have changed a lot over that period as well. Back then, I guess it would have been Navels and Valencias, basically, as far as oranges were concerned.
Yes, exactly. Navels and Valencias. Washingtons and Langs, mainly Washingtons, were the key ones that we found. Mandarins started to be grown a lot more at that time as well. But in terms of the blocks that were out in the Riverland more generally, things did move away from a mix of vines and citrus more towards the citrus. So as we've seen through decades, you have times when vines aren't going well, they rip them all out and they replace them with something else. And based on what's happened in the last year with the vines in the Riverland, similar things I think are happening again. So you see these cycles through history, but in the 50s and 60s, it definitely was a turn towards citrus and those Valencias and Washingtons that had the superior taste and peeling qualities. Yeah, they expanded that a lot.
I'm thinking also transport and packaging has probably changed a lot just in that period, that 30-year period or so.
Absolutely. It's one of the interesting things that I found looking through the industry newsletter, the Australian Citrus News, were these constant articles about different kinds of crates that you could use and the introduction of more single-use plastics. And they're coming up with different ways that they can package to be appealing to the consumers but also to transport longer distances. There's been some speculation about the role of horticultural industries and the massive expansion of single-use plastics that have happened over the last 50, 60 years. It was interesting, obviously that didn't happen specifically in South Australia, but seeing that echoed in the many, many, many articles, column inches given to discussion of boxes from America and packing techniques was, intriguing to see that technology change and be influenced and influential in the Riverland for what works here expands out as well.
Has there been anything that's really surprised you or really piqued your interest in this study?
One of the things that surprised me, just from someone who didn't actually grow up in the Riverland, I didn't know, and maybe more people know this, that the name Riverland didn't actually become the name of the region until the 60s. And it was just, she says, the name of the brand of the oranges that were marketed internationally to begin with by the Murray Citrus Growers Cooperative Association. I think it was 1934 that campaign started. And they suggested turning that name into the regional name in the wake of the 56 flood as part of their campaign to tell everyone that the Riverland's back online and things are back to business as usual. But that didn't really pick up steam until the sort of mid-60s when you get a lot more of investment in tourism, and the Rotary clubs agree that it's a good idea to call it something other than South Australian Upper Murray, because that was a confusing name for people, especially as things became more national. You don't have to tell a South Australian what the Upper Murray is because we know that it's the upper part of our Murray. But if you tell someone from New South Wales the South Australian Upper Murray, they're going to be confused because the Upper Murray is nowhere near South Australia. So this was an ongoing conversation that happened in Riverland places, as well as the Murray Valley Development League, which you may have heard of. They were also very keen to promote and develop the regions along the Murray, and a big part of that was effective tourism and marketing. And a name like Riverland comes with a lot of positive aesthetic sort of images of sunshine and juicy fruits and green fields. So it's a good place to start when it comes to Riverland, and it has the name river in it, of course, so it's not just about horticulture, it's about the beautiful setting of those impressive orchards.
What do you think growers might find most interesting about the research that you're undertaking?
I think that would be interesting to talk to growers about it. So far, I've only really spoken to, my family are very interested in what I'm doing, obviously, because of where it started, and they aren't growers these days. I've spoken to Ian Tolley in Renmark, who's an incredible person to speak to. His memory is, if I could do oral history with him, I think I could write another 200,000 words just based on what he remembers. But I think just the cyclical nature of the way things go in our industries, and it's like slowly improving with knowledge that comes from outside, but it's also place-based knowledge. The problems that have been experienced in the River Murray districts are not new, and they continue to come around with cycles of climate and the river's flows and floods and droughts, as we're all very familiar with. But things do develop, and that is often off the back of the experience and the determination of groups, individuals and groups of people who do the work and see what the land is like and how things vary and change depending on what they do.
Is there anything that growers could help you with as you've come towards the end of your PhD?
Yeah, well, for the PhD, itself. I think if I get any more information, that will probably cause a problem. However, I am keen to keep researching in this area. So after the PhD, so mid-2024, I'm interested to write more about specific places, sort of like how I started with this research, wanting to look at Cooltong. I'd like to look at Chowla, obviously. I think it's a fascinating part of history, the Chowla Dam, playing a big part in the central part of my thesis. But more about the people who lived amongst those groves, because so much of what I've looked at has been from that sort of industry perspective where you really only get one voice from each place. And I know, obviously, that there were families who lived on these blocks out at Cooltong and Renmark and all the way down to Waikerie and Blanchetown. And I'd like to know more about the experience of that from a more holistic perspective and the kinds of experiences that sort of blended between industry and personal and between the cultivated nature and the endemic nature.
Once you've submitted this thesis at the end of your PhD, what happens with it then? Where does it go? What happens with the information? Can growers have a look at it?
Yeah, well, I'm hoping I'd really like to produce at least a couple of articles that are for industry or for local history, those kinds of things that cut out a lot of the academic stuff that people aren't interested in. They may be interested in, but they can go to those academic places to read them, just to give a bit more of that sense of history integrated into the community, because it is such an important part of how the Riverland came to be what it is. I'll also be producing at least a couple of articles that will go into academic journals. And I think I'd like to probably write a book that's like a local history, but a local history of citrus.
That's Amanda Wells, a PhD candidate from the Barossa who has dedicated hundreds of hours to studying the citrus industry and its impact on the Riverland. Thank you for listening to Riverland Women. Make sure you give us a follow on Facebook or Instagram. We're even on YouTube these days, so lots of options for where you can follow us. And you can also subscribe and follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can do that on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to them. Thanks for listening to Riverland Women.